Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started as folks join us. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mina Nutbeam, and I'm the program manager for the CORES program and resident outcomes at SAFE, also known as Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. So thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on approaches to crafting and implementing a resident services theory of change and logic model. Next slide, please. So, if you are less familiar with us, SAFE, or Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, is a collaborative of nonprofits who create affordable homes that are healthy, sustainable, and connect residents to services they need to thrive. The CORES program SAFE offers is a certification that recognizes owner-operators and third-party providers that have developed a robust commitment, capacity, and competency in providing resident services coordination in affordable rental homes. Today, we're excited to offer this webinar to the CORES Network, our longstanding partner NeighborWorks America, and their members as a part of their 2024 Resident Services Peer Convening, and all organizations attending today with a dedication to resident-centered and outcomes-driven services. So thank you all so much for joining us. So just some quick logistical items before we get started. Please feel free to introduce yourself and share resources with each other in the chat. Today's recording and slides are going to be made available to everyone who's registered, and we'll be sharing the links in the chat and links in after the webinar as well that we provide you. If there are any additional resources, please use the Q&A if you have any questions for us or for panelists, and we'll make sure to hold time at the end for those questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we get started, we just wanted to kick off by quickly providing some grounding for today's presentations and conversations. So crafting a theory of change is a really important step in developing resident services programming and identifying how an organization understands and measures the impact of its programs and services. Throughout this process, organizations can pinpoint their goals and map out the steps to achieve them, including the integration of these measures into their service planning and outcomes tracking. Organizations should have a strategic framework, theory of change, or logic model that guides how resident services coordination is implemented across their portfolio. So this webinar highlights approaches for developing, refining, and implementing that theory of change and logic model. And participants will hear from experiences from practitioners at 2 CORES certified organizations, Mercy Housing and Beacon Communities. Next slide, please. So with that, we're incredibly excited to have a handful of wonderful guest presenters today. Start kicking us off, Teresa is the Director of Operations for National Resident Services at Mercy Housing, and she started at Mercy as a Resident Services Coordinator in Washington State in 1999, working at Family Properties before she became a manager for resident services staff in Washington and Idaho. In 2020, Teresa transitioned to the National Resident Services Department at Mercy and led trainings and projects until March of 2022, when she became the Director of Operations for National Resident Services at Mercy. So today, Teresa leads a department that supports 275 resident services staff at approximately 280 properties in 22 states. National Resident Services engages with regions for coordinated impact outcomes, ensures Salesforce database functionality, and provides training and support. So welcome, Teresa. Summer is also joining and is the Director of Data Strategy and Impact at Mercy Housing. She has 20 plus years of postgraduate research experience, including multi-sector experience in program impact evaluation and applied research. She's previously worked on countrywide educational program impact evaluations, establishing best practices in the theory of change methodology at a startup social venture in California, and maintaining program monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems for multinational economic development programs. Welcome, Summer. And then Aviva is the Senior Vice President of Community Engagement at Beacon Communities. She's responsible for creating, aligning, and sustaining the vision and structure of community engagement work at Beacon, And Aviva supports best-in-class resident services, partnership development, and impactful outcomes for communities across their portfolio, and previously worked as the Deputy Director of Program and Strategy at the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She's received her BA in Urban Studies at Brown University and MBA in Nonprofit Management at Brandeis University. And last but not least, Washina is the Vice President of Community Engagement at Beacon Communities, where she manages the implementation of resident services program delivery throughout New England, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. She's an active board member of the New England Resident Services Coordinators, Inc., and Washina has dedicated her career to the advancement and empowerment of underserved.
Did we lose Mina?
Sounds like it.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. We will, hopefully she'll be rejoining in just a moment. Amy, can we advance to the next slide? So Teresa, would you mind jumping in and kicking us off and as Mina rejoins?
Yeah, no, happy to. Absolutely. So thanks for having us. Just like Mina was saying, my name's Teresa. I work with Mercy Housing, and I started as a resident services coordinator, and I lead the kind of the support group within Mercy Housing for resident services. So that means I don't do any direct supervision of site staff anymore, but we collaborate and work to provide training and support for all of the resident services staff across the country. Summer is our new, I'm still saying new, Summer, I hope that still sounds right. She started with us less than a year ago, and is a professional in data development. So we have like both ends of the spectrum here today talking about program models. I've worked in the work and done the work for a long, long time, and Summer's telling us, it's helping me understand how we're evaluating it. So really excited to be here. And what we are going to do today is talk about where we came from as an organization around our data or around our logic models. And then Summer is going to take us through where she sees us going. So it's kind of this point in time of Mercy has had logic models for a long, long time in place, but now that we have a professional data strategist looking at it with us, she's making some recommendations on how we can continue to evolve as an organization. It's a really exciting place for us to be, and y'all are going to just kind of hear about how that's working at Mercy right now. I do want to pause and talk about Mercy Housing just for a moment, just in case you're not familiar with the organization. Mercy Housing is the largest nonprofit affordable housing provider in the country. We have properties in 22 states being operated and developed, and I think it's 345 properties. That number changes fairly regularly, so that's the number we're sticking with today. In the introduction, it explained that we support resident service staff in about 280 properties. We just don't have resident services staff at all of our properties. So Big Mercy, 345 properties across 22 states. We develop in 5 regions. So we have regional development offices working in 5 parts of the country, and continue to build more housing. Summer, is there anything else that we should say before we got started?
No, I think that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think we're ready for the next slide. Yes. So I wanted to start with this slide because this is the program model that is currently posted in the resources with cores. It's the logic model we used for a long, long time, and it's this. I always call it the Brown model. But that's the logic model we used for a long, long time. So it's it does. I'm just giving a quick snapshot of it. We're not going to go into it, but this is the model that we use to develop what we're currently using as our logic models. This original iteration came from when I actually started at Mercy. We just kind of did programs however we want to do programs. It's 25 years ago, and site staff were just charged with talking to residents, doing something. We do whatever the grant writers had money for us to do. We did programs and activities that sounded like fun. We tried to support our residents in anything that they wanted to support around. And probably 2 years into my work at Mercy, we did a survey where the organization asked all the coordinators, so what do you do here? Like, what programs and services and activities do you do? And they came back with about 1,400 different services across the organization. We were much smaller then, but there was about 1,400 different activities being listed. And so Mercy put them into 5 broad buckets. And from there, worked with some folks, some consultants, some professionals to say, okay, so if these are the kinds of services we're providing, we think these are the outcomes that we're going to be impacting for our residents over time. And that's where this logic model really came from. We did look at what we do here and what we thought, how we're impacting the changes for our residents. So that's where our logic models really originated. It was from that original survey of 1,400 different programs across the organization. So it ended up in 5 what we called priority program areas: health and wellness, what we're calling now is housing success, financial well-being, community engagement, and youth development. So we have these 5 areas that we're working in. So we're ready, I think. And so for the next slide, so our current logic models, and I'm gonna go through each of the 5 very quickly, just so you have a sense of what we're looking at. It's so much prettier now. Very excited about that. So we've got we do have 3 versions of our program model. We have a family housing, a senior housing, and a permanent supportive housing version that are fairly the same. I just picked the family one to dig into right now. So we've got, you can see our inputs are essential activities, the services that we're providing with our residents. Our outputs are, connected to those. In the long term, we're hoping that our residents are co-partnering with us to create communities that they want to grow and thrive in. And residents are reporting greater self-efficacy and collective efficacy. So our big goals for our family program model for community engagement. Next one. Financial well-being. This is not as much as a focus for Mercy Housing. We do, a lot of our sites do provide a lot of financial well-being programming. It wasn't identified as one of our national impact areas because not every region focuses on financial well-being, but it is, we are looking for households to be financially secure and have adequate income or stable and increasing assets for our family program model around financial well-being. And our next slide is for health and wellness. Health and wellness is identified as one of our national impact areas. So Summer is doing a ton of analysis of our data around our health program right now. For our family properties, we want residents to report overall self-reported health, good overall self-reported health. And then next slide. Housing success. We want residents to be renters in good standing, and residents who move out do so for positive move out reasons. We want residents to either stay and be successfully housed or moving on to because they're choosing to, and they're looking for better housing that better fits their families at this time. And finally, we've got our out of school time program model for youth development. Currently, our long-term impacts are around youth graduating on time, and youth apply for future opportunities, including secondary education, technical training, or military service. So that's what our program model currently looks like. And Summer has come in and asked a lot of questions and learned a lot about what we do here, and has made some thoughts about how we can do our work in a, yeah, I'm gonna let Summer talk about how she's gonna do that, what she wants to recommend for us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
Yes, so before I start, maybe I'll give you just a quick sense of where the theory of change methodology kind of picked up pace from. It picked up pace in the mid to late 90s at intergovernmental organizations like UNICEF, United Nations agencies like UNDP. And the purpose of it really was there were a lot of economic development programs that were spending a lot of money on things that weren't working or people didn't know if they were working or not. So for example, like literacy programs or reproductive health programs that weren't having the desired effect. So there was a need then for a methodology, a framework for program impact evaluation. And since then, for the last, 30 years or so, there's been a growing community of practice in the international economic development space around the theory of change methodology. And it's gone through several iterations and several improvements to best practices. And so keeping that in mind, I think when we look at a logic model, or let's say a program logic model, I think we need to also think, well, what purpose is it serving? What's the audience that it is geared towards? So when I look at this family program model here, I see that it's actually really good kind of, shall we call it, external stakeholder facing, public facing artifact, right? It's very easy to read. It has all the information of a functional or operational logic model, but it isn't necessarily at the level of detail that you would need it for laying a foundation of a data strategy or an impact evaluation framework or an impact evaluation strategy. So there are different uses for what is often referred to as a logic model or a logical framework. And what I'm going to show you is kind of how, when I came into Mercy Housing, the first thing that I need to understand as an impact evaluation professional is what is the program? So what is the definition of the program? And what I've learned, what I've seen over the course of my career in the nonprofit sector, not the intergovernmental organization sector, but the nonprofit sector in the United States, is there's some level of ambiguity around what the program is, and some level of ambiguity about what our hypotheses are. And the solution to that is to take whatever maybe logic model artifact that you have and all the subject matter expertise of the people who are designing and implementing the programs and put together a functional version of what you're seeing on the screen right here. And so what I want to do is just spend the next 5 minutes or so just to give you kind of a very high level walkthrough of the anatomy of a functional logic model. And hopefully by the end of that, you'll be able to see the usefulness of it. And I'm not a graphic designer. And so what you're going to see is not very pretty because I did it myself, right? I went and used a software but it shows you kind of the anatomy of these things. So if you just move to the next slide, basically, logic models organize a program's activities. So a program's activities are the definition of the program, right? It's where the program begins and ends. It's what the program is, but it's also what the program isn't. And so it takes those activities and their impacts, and it puts them in 3 sequential parts. It's very linear. One of the biggest criticisms of the theory of change methodology and logic models is it's too linear and doesn't account for the complexity of reality. And that's fine, because we're not, what it's supposed to be is a map of the terrain. It's not meant to be the terrain itself. The map of the city that helps you navigate through the city is not, the same as the city itself, right? But it's still very useful. And so sometimes folks can kind of get sidetracked with, well, but it's more complex than that. We're actually looking for simplicity here. Okay, so those 3 sequential parts are the what, right? This is the first thing we do. It's the services our teams deliver to residents. And our program the definition of the program is that it is the totality of the activities that we activate in order to deliver the program. So that's sometimes called inputs and outputs. And sometimes you differentiate between an input as the activity and the output as the deliverable, you know. But those are kind of nuances that only nerds like me geek out on. Okay, so consider this the what. We start with the what, and then the second sequential part, if you could just move to the next, thank you, is how is this, how are we going to experience phase transitions? Because remember, it's a theory of change, how change is going to occur. And so change occurs in phases. There's a short-term phase, there's an intermediate phase, there's a long-term ultimate phase. If you think about how a phase transitions actually comes from physics. So, you know, like for example, if I have an ice cube and I put some heat under it, you can tell when that ice cube starts to transition from solid liquid to solid form to liquid. And eventually, so that's a phase transition from solid to liquid. And then from liquid to gas, that's another phase transition. And so it's very similar here. What we're following is kind of the laws of physics, is that we do these activities and we're supposed to start to see changes in behavior and environment, behavior of the program participants and the environment of the program participants. And then we're going to, once those changes take place, then something else is going to emerge, right? And then ultimately, our theory is that we're going to achieve our ultimate desired outcome. So we start with the what, then the short-term and intermediate outcomes are the how, and then the ultimate phase transition is, well, it's really our why we're doing all these things we're doing. It's our rationale for why our program looks the way it looks. So if we were to go back and look at, let's go back 2 slides, if you don't mind, please. Great. So now you see what an example of the inputs here is an individual action plan, an AIP goal related to health and wellness goals and regular case management for residents in permanent supportive housing is an activity that our resident service coordinators provide. When we, at intake, when we have a resident move in, we sit down and we craft an individual action plan and we set goals. These are health goals, and also provide regular case management, right? So that's the what of what we do. And in the medium term, so on the next slide, we follow that through, and we saying that we expect then to see that after we do that, that permanent supportive housing resident actions are taking place around the goals in the IAP, right, in the individual action plan. And then if so, they're taking actions around that, they're trying to achieve that. And then of course, in the intermediate outcome, we expect them to achieve those goals. And we expect then as a result for their health scores and to improve. And we use something called the Arizona Self-Sufficiency Matrix in some regions to track progress of our residents in terms of health and other forms of self-sufficiency. And so finally, why are we doing all of that? Are we doing it just to improve people's health? Well, actually, our ultimate outcome, the thing that we're really looking for is to ensure that our residents who are systemically disadvantaged and traditionally come from marginalized or excluded groups, historically excluded groups, what we want to see, the reason for all of that, is we want to see them to be the health outcomes to be on par or above the general population. So we want to close the disparities and a few other things. So that's kind of the progression of and the logic of the theory of change. It's linear, but it also has components, right? So if we move on to the next slide, we can. Perfect. And so I've just walked you through it, so we can move on to the next slide after that. Great. So they have components. We need to be very intentional about those 3 components when we create them, the wording, the definition, and there can be a lot of back and forth to get the wording right. So the first component is the indicator. So you know those green pills that you see on the screen? The one that I used was permanent supportive housing residents achieve IAP goals. That's the indicator. So what does the indicator do? It's the thing that we're going to measure, right? So that indicator is I can go into Salesforce now and I can check whether the resident service coordinator created an individual action plan for that resident. So that when I check to see if it's been done, if I get a yes or a no, that's measuring the indicator, right? So the second component, if you go to the next slide, please, is the measure. And it's the same picture, so what I did when I entered Mercy is I kind of connected the dots that with the logic models that they had all the information I needed. And with Teresa's extensive knowledge and experience of 25 years, if there's something I didn't know, it's very easy for me to get a reliable answer. And so as you can see, I created I separated those indicators. They're not all sitting together. But then I also looked at the data that we collect to see what are we actually measuring, right? And so that's how you can identify gaps. You realize there might be a really important indicator. Are we measuring it sufficiently, with the questions that we're asking in the surveys? Do we need to make any tweaks? But you kind of lay it all out and you break it down into sort of the most essential building blocks of your program. So for example, residents report fewer poor mental health days is an indicator of improvements in our residents, behavioral health, right? And so I put a yellow triangle there, and I have a list down here of all the survey questions, so variables within different surveys that we collect that measure and that can probably tell me about how residents' mental health days, poor mental health days are going. So we ask them questions. There's a question we ask about stress they've experienced in the past week, the Arizona matrix, self-sufficiency matrix average score. We also ask them a question from the behavioral risk factors, from the CDC, which is asked them to reflect on how many negative mental health days they had in the past 30 days, and so on and so forth. So I laid that out. I wasn't saying that these are the measures we need, but these are the measures we have. And then secondly, the most important component of the logic model, in my opinion, and probably not just my opinion, let's go to the next slide. It's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is really for your data analysis and reporting and continuous improvement. Without the hypothesis, you cannot easily continuously improve the program because you don't know where to look for the improvements on a regular basis. And so we see the hypothesis here actually in the phase transitions. So it's the lines between the inputs, outputs to short outcomes. You see how there's a green line between, if you can just, is it possible to make that a little bit larger so folks can see the wording?
I don't think we can make it larger, but we will be sharing slides.
Awesome. But I'm going to bring I'm not, my eyes are not that great. So I'm just going to read it over here. Just give me a second. So the first one in the inputs and outputs is, what does it say? Food. You know what? Let me open my own, I'm getting older, folks.
Somewhere I can see it. That first category is food benefits acquisition, for example, SNAP and food pantry.
Yeah. So that's the activity, right? And those are the two things. We provide food benefit acquisition. We help people apply. And we also provide access to a food pantry. It might be on site or a nearby food bank. And so in the short term, if we do that, our hypothesis is that residents are going to access them, right? That they're going to use their SNAP benefits, and they're going to access the pantry and use it. Okay, so now they're accessing the pantry. And then our hypothesis is that after accessing the pantry, what's going to happen is residents become food secure. And why are we doing all of this? Because, well, it contributes to all these health and wellness ultimate outcomes, right? We do need to be food secure in order for us to be not stressed, in order for us to be healthy physically, and so on and so forth. So these are the hypotheses. And so if I know what my hypotheses are, I can actually also work backwards. So for example, if I've done all of these, if my residents are reporting that they're not food secure, what I can go back and do is look at the data at, well, are they accessing the food resources that are on site or that are available to them? Because my hypothesis links the activity with an outcome that I can measure, with a short-term outcome that I can measure, and an intermediate outcome that I can measure. And then my activities, I'm also keeping a record of them as well for compliance. So you can work backwards diagnostically if your hypothesis isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. But let's say, for example, there's another reason why they're food insecure. Let's say we're dealing with a population where there's a lot of trauma around food insecurity. And so it doesn't really matter how much food there is. This could be a post-traumatic stress response, right? And so then I can say, okay, well, my hypothesis isn't working for this specific group because actually what's going to drive food security is addressing post-traumatic stress instead, right? And so that's kind of the usefulness of making sure that we have delineated hypotheses. Okay, so I'll stop here. There was only one last slide where he kind of put it all together for housing success. And now I'm hopeful that you'll be able to kind of read through the logic model so you can see what our hypotheses that we're testing are.
Thanks so much, Summer. So unfortunately, Mina is still having some issues. She has an internet outage where she's calling in from today. So I will transition us over to Aviva and Washina Beacon, who are going to talk about the application of many of these principles in their own work in Beacon communities. So welcome, Aviva and Washina.
Thank you. We can move to the next slide. I'm Washina Ford. I'm the Vice President of Community Engagement for Beacon Communities. And so today we're going to go over our theory of change. And our theory of change is really starting from a place in which there's so much great work going on within the organization, and we really needed to identify ways to really streamline and storytell the amazing work that we're doing through the impact and what we hope to achieve over the next 5 years. So a little bit about Beacon. Our goal, similar to many other housing developers, is really to create and nurture healthy communities. And so we're based in Boston. We have communities in over 150 communities, 11 states in the District of Columbia. Myself, I'm based in Maryland. And I support a lot of our communities that are outside of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And Aviva really leans in on our Massachusetts and Connecticut sites. Community engagement has grown so much within our organization over the last couple of years. We've acquired new properties, and in acquiring those new properties, we brought in additional support through resident services. And so now we're at about 65, 66 RSCs throughout our entire portfolio, which really just shows the growth of the work that we're doing and the theory of change in action. So a little bit about our strategic framework and the theory of change, where we got started. So when we first entered the organization, it was very important to understand where we were. And we instantly knew that there was a need to be more strategic in the way that we were speaking about our work. And what we focused on, I think we can all relate that within resident services, we wear many hats. We are all superheroes, and there's a lot that we want to take on. But realistically and practically, we cannot manage it all, and the capacity and our bandwidth of our teams, it's very important that we're helping them manage it. And so we really had to identify what was realistic for us to focus on to make sure that the team's work, we can clearly convey and communicate that impact and identify ways later to measure it. In addition to that, we needed to identify the tools that we were going to use to be able to tell this story. And that's internal to as we're communicating with our colleagues within our organization, as well as external, as we're communicating with peers, but also our community partners and stakeholders who are all equally invested in the communities that we support. Setting goals were very important. That kind of connects back to our understanding what our strategic plan was and getting more focused on the work. We really needed to drill down to what will we be able to actually accomplish? What do we actually want the resident service coordinators to spend a lot of their day-to-day time on? And operationally, what is also going to move our communities forward towards transformation? And so we had to look and take a look at where we are now and come up with what our 5-year vision is. And I like to say a lot, we threw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. We had to see what was going to stick. And how we were going to make that happen. And I would say lastly here, but most importantly, was the feedback from all of our teams across the organization, and working and meeting with them to hear their feedback on what's important to them, what are the residents saying is important to them, what are the areas, the gaps that we're missing when we're looking at this work day to day, and how to prioritize that, because we can't take it all on. And so being able to provide really good guidance and structure to the RSCs to be as impactful as they can be has been why we felt it was important to take that opportunity to take a step back and look at the big picture that we're really working with and trying to accomplish. So in developing our framework, again, throwing spaghetti at the wall, there were many brainstorming sessions that included champions within the organization who really supported our work, and others who didn't understand it. Maybe they came from communities that this is their first time having an RSC, and what does that look like to work with an RSC, and what does that look like for them to be able to support the community. So there were a lot of conversations that we dove straight into within the organization. And it was important that through those conversations, through the collection of information and resources and where we were, that we understood how to connect that to our Beacon's vision, to our cornerstone, to our core values, to who we are as an organization. RSCs wanted to know, how does what I do meeting with this resident connect to the larger picture of the organization? We know it's important, but tell us the why. And so we set off on that journey to define the why through this work. We had a lot of conversations with peers within the with peers throughout the industry on best practices, gathering more resident data. And then we employed an entire change management process to implement the framework. And we're still doing that. We're still in our change management process. A lot of this work and the way that we're defining it right now started over the last 2 years. And so we're still very much so in that beginning stage of defining and implementing our big picture plan. So in collecting information and really being able to come to a place of where we can be realistic and really have an impact to develop change over time, we were able to think about our theory of change and where it needs to start. And it needed to start with defining what our priorities were at our seniors and our multifamily sites. And at our senior sites, and multifamily, housing stabilization across the board is important, right? Like, it's all of our responsibilities to make sure that we're doing our due diligence, that residents are able to live long-term in our communities and stably within our communities. And so for senior priorities, housing stabilization, community building, and health and wellness. For our multifamily properties, housing stabilization, community building, economic mobility and education, and youth enrichment, really thinking about that out of school time and how we can really lean in to support our communities there. So as we're looking at that, we did go down to identify what our goal statements will be, how we will measure that and our outcomes. It was important that when we're looking at housing stabilization, that we're not just saying housing stabilization, but we're able to define what that goal looks like when we achieve housing stabilization, what that goal looks like when we achieve community engagement. And so that understanding what the end goal would be and what that impact would be for the resident and the community is where we started. And then we kind of came back in the process to identify what the metrics would be to measure to ensure that we are actually accomplishing that goal and being successful. So for our goal statement, we wanted to achieve this work within this priority. For the metrics for success, those are the activities, the outcomes, and what we can look like over time. And our outcomes are how we're going to make this progress towards our goal. And so we did a lot of resource mapping. We did a lot of partnership mapping. We worked with our teams to really understand what programs are currently going on, what are the needs that are happening. Lots of conversations with our property managers, our residents with that feedback to really narrow down where our sweet spot is, right? Where that area is that we really need to lean in and do support there. So, I think one of the things that I want to just kind of add here as we're looking at these slides of the theory of change is this is the big picture, right? We're still in the beginning. We have not done the steps of complete data collection, but right now we're laying that framework and that groundwork for us to be able to understand how we want to use data when we have it. As we're looking at the senior priorities, the goal statements are very clear here around housing stabilization and its role in eviction prevention as where we're leaning in here. RSCs do outreach to residents to make referrals, assist residents as needed to preserve housing stability. A lot of referrals out, a lot of rental assistance application, a lot of one-on-one work with residents to identify action steps, and empowering residents and educating residents on their role as well as being able to support in that eviction prevention process. Community building to reduce social isolation and health and wellness of aging in place. Here again, under our families, when we're looking at our goals for our multifamily properties, housing stabilization, again, is our number one thing that we are strategizing around, and that's that eviction prevention. When we're looking at community building, improving social connection, economic mobility, the connection to opportunities, and enrichment around our engaged youth. So around all of these things are where we're really looking to focus and give RSCs some structure of how it looks like to go step by step in implementing the work, measuring the work, understanding the why, the what, how is this information going to be used to advance their day-to-day.
Great. Thanks, Washina. So today we're just giving you a deep dive on our housing stabilization kind of theory of change with a look at our metrics for success and outcomes. We have developed all the metrics for success and outcomes for all of our strategic priorities, and they will be they're on the Corps' website and in our strategic framework theory of change that you can find there. So today we're just talking about housing stabilization and eviction prevention. So here you can see that in terms of metrics of success, we're looking at the number of residents RSCs do outreach to for non-payment of rent, the number of residents RSCs assist in helping resolve the non-payment of rent, so it's both outreach and resolving, the number of emergency rental assistance applications submitted, the number of residents successfully enrolled or re-enrolled in benefits and entitlements, and that one is particularly focused at our senior sites. Oftentimes at senior sites, they're paying rent, but they're not necessarily getting the other things that they need for daily living. And so we wanted to include a measure. This was thinking about our change model, our change management model. We went to our senior RSCs and we brought to them what our proposal was. And it was a senior RSC who said to us, hey, I'm at a senior site. I don't have a lot of folks who aren't paying rent, but this is what I spend my time on and it's not being captured. And we said, you're right. We need to change that. So just that's a side note about, I'm going to talk a little bit more later about that, but that's how we kind of came to include this number of residents successfully enrolling in benefits and entitlements under kind of the housing stabilization umbrella. And then the last one is the dollar amount of emergency rental assistance secured. And this really varies across our states based on the available resources. So we know that, and it's not that we're looking to reach an X target, because we know that the availability of funds varies. It has been constricted post pandemic, all of the things, but we are looking over time, what is that dollar amount? And then of course the outcome is housing stability. That's the fundamental goal, but we're also looking to connect it to, and I'm going to show a slide later about how we connect it to our Beacon cornerstones. These are goals that an entire company are reaching towards. So like reduction in non-payment court actions and evictions, property cash flow increases due to rent payment, rental assistance and benefits secured, and residents are stably housed, their tenancy is preserved, and that again leads to decreased unit turnover. So you'll see that we're very purposefully connecting it to that double bottom line that speaks not just to the work that we do in our department, but to the entire company in property management. So we wanted to sort of think about how did we, that's kind of the theory of change. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about how did we integrate it into the tools, what were the tools that were needed, and how did we then roll it out across our entire department. So on the topic of integrating it into our tools, we have done it in a couple of ways. So we've integrated it into our onboarding materials. We have integrated into our budget workbook. So budgets are now done within these strategic priorities, and you see how much are you spending on housing stabilization? How much are you spending on youth development? What percentage of your budget? So you can really see that really clearly. We've integrated into our property plan services template and all of our kind of cores documentation that goes with it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our property service plan in the next slide. We're also revisiting our resident community survey and aligning it there. And then in the future, it's really going to connect to our Power BI dashboards. In terms of the rollout to staff, we've really tried to use change management principles, which means that we're looking for active feedback from our teams in the field. They are doing this day to day. How can we incorporate it? I just gave you one example. Also really framing it, because it's true, this is work you've been doing all along. You've been doing housing stability. You've been working on economic mobility when you created English as a second language class, or when you refer someone to a workforce development opportunity. You are working on health and wellness every time you do a falls prevention. So this is the work you're already doing. What we are doing is creating a story that is consistent across the entire department and across all of our properties. So that was a big piece of it. We did multiple rounds of feedback. We went to our regional staff, to our senior RSCs. We piloted things. We took that feedback, reintegrated it. And then we did in-person staff training. We bring our entire team together at the nurse conference and use that as an opportunity to both do in-person training, to have staff who had piloted some of the resources for us report out and say, this is what I found to be useful, and this is how it worked. And then we also do consistent review at regional meetings and in one-on-ones to kind of reinforce. So I want to talk a little bit now about our property services plan template. Okay, now I have not a lot of time left. So I will say that it is new. We rolled it out at NERSC, and there are a couple of different components to it. There's the why. I love how everyone's using that language of the why, the what, right? So the why is the strategic priority. That's actually pre-populated. The two things that the RSCs need to fill out is the what and the who. The what is the key characteristics that inform your strategic approach. So it's, what do you know about your property? We have them pull a demographic report. What have you heard from your feedback, from your residents? What do you know from your own experience? And what is that annual kind of strategic vision that's going to inform your approach? And then who are the strategic partners who are going to help you with that? The rest of the three categories are all pre-populated. If we go to the next slide, I'll quickly talk about our quarterly plan. Based on this annual strategic vision, every RSC creates a quarterly plan where they talk about the how. Okay, you said that you've got a lot of folks coming in who are formerly unhoused and there are housekeeping issues. So what are you going to do to address it? The who, what's the target, how many people, and what's the frequency and participation. And then at the end of the quarter, we do a reflect and assess and adjust. So what's the actual frequency and participation? And then why? Reflect on why it was lower or higher or different than what you thought. And how does that then carry over to how you think about your next quarter plan? Next slide. Couple of ways we hold ourselves accountable. In terms of the property services plan, I just kind of walked through how on a quarterly basis, folks are setting goals and then revisiting that. We also do a monthly data review. We track our progress, look at the metrics. And then again, we're going to be using that to kind of connect to a larger Power BI data connected to property management data platform. And then obviously the last piece is that through our performance goals, we have created performance goals that are consistent across the entire department in these 6 areas. And then RSCs work with their supervisor to personalize each performance goal to themselves and to their own property. But everyone is working towards financial results, team environment, resident experience, industry partnerships, and then a Beacon core value. And the reason, next slide, we are working towards those 6 goals is because they align with our Beacon-wide, property management-wide Beacon cornerstones you will notice those same exact categories. Next slide. And to our Beacon-wide being Beacon core values, which is why that's our 6th performance goal. And that is how folks will be evaluated at the end of the year. So again, very purposefully using the same structure that our entire company is using and that our property management peers and colleagues are using at the property to think about how we're holding ourselves accountable to this work. Next slide, we're at the beginning and the work continues. Hand back to Alexandra.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Thank you, all of our panelists. I want to acknowledge, one of the reasons that we picked this topic in particular for this session is that we see a lot of organizations submitting logic models or theories of change, or they're in various stages of working on their data strategy. And we're all in really different places with it. And sometimes it happens in a little bit of an ad hoc manner, that we have a funder that has certain measures that are important to them, or we had an initiative that started several years ago and we started to measure something. And so we sort of lose track of this bigger picture map, roadmap, theory of change, logic model, the tools that Summer did a great job of sort of talking about the different components that help to guide the work. And both of these organizations have done a really fantastic job of building out a tool that helps not just to articulate the work externally, but really to guide the work operationally and links sort of tactically to the different forms of engagement they have with residents, together as teams, and the tools that they're using for measuring and assessing. So we're really excited to share these resources. Slides will be available. We have a number of these tools and resources that have been shared in the CORE's resource library. I do have a couple of questions since we have a few minutes, and I encourage folks who have joined, if you have questions for the panelists, please share them or add any other comments in the chat. Your both organizations have been engaged in this work for a long time. What would you say, what would you say is a good starting place, or one piece of advice that you would recommend to other organizations as they're starting this work? Maybe Summer and Teresa, we can start with you.
I mean, I think it's good to get a really good idea of what you're doing and not be too optimistic about the impacts that you're making. Like, you're making great impacts. You don't need to exaggerate them. And find and get somebody who's who's a professional at figuring that stuff out with you, because it's complicated, and doing it well with help is more is it's just it'll be a better faster process than trying to do it alone.
I would
I-
add that change is incremental. It takes time, and to also think about how much your team can absorb at once. And as much as you might see kind of the longer term vision, what are those step by steps that need to happen, and how do you bring your team along, and how do you bring others along in your organization on the journey as well, in terms of the value proposition.
I would add to that. I would second what Teresa said about having a professional work with all the subject matter experts in the organization to develop the theory of change, and also not to be too precious about logic models, because you're going to find out that you're wrong about a lot of things, and you have to throw the logic model out and start with a new one. So it's not static, it's a living document, and it's going through a continuous process of assumption testing, and also like developing a culture where there's a lot of psychological safety about sharing the data as well.
Yeah.
And I would just add around the education that you have to put in to make sure that we're bringing all the resident service coordinators along. When it comes to the work, the day-to-day, the meetings with the residents, the programs is really where the passion is. And when it comes to the data pieces, sometimes that can feel like an extra piece. And so the purpose of the why and the importance of how it connects it's so important that story connects to the RSEs. And so it takes time, but we have to be really intentional that even if it's a small step, that we're taking the time to educate the RSCs so that they see the full picture of why we're asking for data.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you all for joining us. If we can just quickly go to the next slide. We've mentioned this, but if you haven't been on the CORE's website, there are quite a few resources. Next slide, sorry, Amy. With all kinds of tools, templates. There were a bunch of questions specifically. Are the resources from today going to be shared? Yes. We will have a recording of today. We will be sharing all the slides, and several of the tools are already available in the resource library so that you can access them there. So with that, wish you all a good afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.